breaks like push to talk rules because I played
Oh,
it before. So
okay. All right. So AQ40 is gigantic. There is a lot of trash inside of it. It's much heavier on the trash at the end of the instance than it is at the front of the instance, but there is quite a lot of trash and some bosses and 3 optional bosses and 6 mandatory bosses in order to finish the instance. This top left up here, Temple's Entrance, is where you come in, you fight Prophet Scarum, and then where this A is on the map, you go down and you pretty much do a big circle around the entire map until you get back to the A on the map and you go up into Cthulhu's chamber. The reason I mention this is because the boss rooms are gigantic. Depending on the boss, if we wipe, we are going to be running back because the bosses have gigantic aggro radiuses. They're in gigantic rooms. It's going to be very hard to res people depending on the encounter. So I just wanted to show everybody the map and point it out so that everybody was aware of how big this place is and how large the boss rooms are. So, on to our first boss. It's Prophet Scarum. When you enter AQ40, you're going to go through the door. There's a few trash packs, which I'm not really covering trash in this PowerPoint, but there is some complicated trash, and it is definitely good to be aware of that as well. But once you clear the trash packs, you're going to be fighting Prophet Scarum. He has a few abilities. The first one is True Fulfillment. It's a mind control. You can't dispel it, and the person who gets it needs to be crowd controlled. So you turn gigantic, you get big and red, and you start slapping your friends. The mind control is the reason that we need 6 tanks for this fight, because when you encounter the boss, he's alone. When he gets to 75% health, 50% health, and 25% health, he creates 2 copies of himself, and they need to be tanked. So each copy, the safest way to do it is to have 2 tanks on each copy so that if one of the tanks gets mind controlled, the other one is there to pick it up. That is going to be where DeVito's off tanks are going to get their time to shine. And you don't have to be prot spec or anything for this. You can be a Fury Warrior with a shield, but you just have to be ready to pick these things up quickly. And the reason you have to be able to pick them up quickly is because he has an ability called Earth Shock that will zap people with lightning who have aggro and are outside of melee range. So if one of our friendly mages or warlocks or hunters pulls aggro on one of the copies, it will Earth Shock them deep into the ground. So it is very important to pick them up quickly and to control when you are doing your splits. DPS may need to slow if you are reaching 50% and the splits are not dead. The other thing that he does is an arcane explosion that can be interrupted. It can also be, the cast time can be slowed by Curse of Tongues or Mind Numbing Poison. It is preferable to be interrupting this arcane explosion with a rogue or a shield bash, or mages can counterspell it as well. You just don't want this to go off. It'll do a lot of damage to the people in melee range, and if you can prevent it, that's the way you want to do it. With all those abilities covered, the Greater Arcane Protection Potion is a must for everyone in case a arcane explosion goes off, and probably for the first few attempts, we're going to want most of the ranged DPS to be using Nature Protection Potions to protect from Earth Shocks until all of our tanks are quick on picking up the boss. Other than that, the boss is tauntable, and he has about 500k health, so think like, Gar or Geddon, I believe, have about 500k. He's definitely on the lower end of boss health pools, and he should go down pretty quickly. So here is the strategy video that I will play.
Our next segment focuses on raid positioning, where you will see all of the areas that tanks, healers, and DPS are located at during the fight.
Everybody hear it?
The fight will begin with all members of the raid group following the main tank forward up the stairs. At this point, the raid will split up to their assigned positions, with the main tank focusing on Scarum and tanking him where he stands or against the back wall. Fury warriors and rogues assigned to the middle platform will follow their main tank and begin their DPS rotations as soon as possible. At the same time, warriors and rogue teams will break off for the left and right platforms to get ready for Scarum's clone ability at 75% health. It is recommended to have at least 2 tanks on each platform due to the possibility of mind control so that the other can take over. We will cover this ability in a later segment. Healers will be forced to cover a wide area that includes the left platform, back area behind Scarum, and right platform as dictated by the healing assignments from your officers. Finally, ranged DPS will always place themselves behind Scarum and above the highest staircases. Expect to always be on the move, as we will see in later segments. Quartile Split is Scarum's signature ability, where he will split into 3 versions of himself at 75, 50, and 25% health. Out of these 3 entities, 2 will be illusions, while the third will be the real one. Keep in mind that the illusions possess the same abilities as the real one we will cover later in this section. There are several options that your raid can do to identify the real ones. However, in my experience, the easiest is having your warlocks use drain mana at the start of the fight until his mana pool is at roughly 389 to 390,000 mana. This is because during the splits, the clones will always have full mana, while the real one will not. Nerve Shock is a dangerous range spell the Scarum uses when the player he is fixated on is out of his melee range. This spell is visualized by a blue electric discharge from your character when being hit by it. It is generally advised that all ranged DPS and healers use greater nature protection potions for this fight to absorb the nature damage that ranges between 2500 to 3000 damage per second. As long as ranged DPS watch their threat at key moments that result in aggro wipes, such as when Scarum teleports to another platform, or when he splits into 3 versions of himself at each quartile of his health, this ability is generally not too bad to deal with. On a final note, limited invulnerability potions, if used quick enough, can drop your aggro for 6 seconds. However, if tanks are reacting fast enough, this should rarely have to be used. Arcane Explosion is a random spell cast by Scarum that deals 1000 to 1500 arcane damage in the form of a massive AoE explosion. It can be interrupted by abilities such as Rogue's Kick or Warrior's Pummel. It can also be affected by spells such as Curse of Tongues by Warlocks or Mind-Numbing Poison from Rogues. It is recommended that every member of the raid use greater arcane protection potions until the content is on farm status. True Fulfillment is Prophet Scarum's mind control spell that can affect any member of the raid group. While under the effects, the player receives a massive damage boost, which means that they must be CC'd immediately, otherwise they will begin one-shotting players in your raid group. Lastly, there is the possibility that one of the tanks on Scarum, or a clone, may become mind controlled, which means it will be up to the other tank, or another tank somewhere in your raid, to take control of the situation. Blink is a random periodic teleport to any nearby platform that occurs at certain intervals. The most important thing about this ability is that it is a total threat wipe each time the Scarum does it. Ranged DPS must be extremely cautious with their targets.
Okay, Scarum. So really the tricky part with him is the positioning and making sure that you're picking up the clones as quickly as possible. This is the positioning from another view. If we can use our mounts, because this part of the instance is technically outside, so even though we won't have bug mounts yet or running around inside AQ, the general positioning is the tanks and melee DPS will run up the steps and grab Scarum. Healers and range DPS are going to split up either side of the steps and kind of spread themselves around the horseshoe of the back staircases and the back of the back of the platform. So when he splits, you just need to make sure that you're prepared for it, because you can control when he splits, because it's always at 75%, 50%, 25% health. So your off tanks, your rogues who are going to be kicking the arcane explosions need to pick up the adds. Supposedly, if you mark the boss with a raid marker, you can tell very easily which one is the real one. If that's not the case, then you can do the mana drain, but I think that it'll be fairly obvious based on how much damage and how quickly the fakes are going down. They have much less health than the actual boss. The only tricky part about the splits is that sometimes both clones can appear on the same part of the platform, at which point your off tank, the two off tanks would have to pick up, and the melee DPS would have to shift in order to kill the clones. So Scarum is pretty straightforward. The second boss is Battleguard Sertora. Sertora has 3 adds that are in the room with her. This fight takes place in a pretty gigantic room. You need 2 tanks on the boss and 1 tank for each of the royal guards. So again, that's going to be 5 tanks total. So our off tanks are definitely going to be getting utilized here. Sertora primary ability is her whirlwind. When she whirlwinds, she's immune to stun, she gets increased movement speed, and players need to move away from the boss while it's being cast. The other thing that she does is this reset aggro ability where she drops aggro and she'll chase a random player for 5 seconds. So you'll see the positioning in the video, but the primary goal with this boss is to make sure that you're all very spread out, and that if she starts whirlwinding and chasing people, she is not able to hit very many people or any people at all. The consumables recommended for this fight on that note are the limited invulnerability potion. It's kind of your oh shit button. If she starts going after you and you can't get out of there quickly enough, it will definitely save your life if you have a few of these in your bag and you're quick to use them if you're getting caught in the whirlwinds. Similarly to Sertora, the Royal Guards have the same ability. They've got Whirlwind, they'll drop aggro and start chasing people. They also have a knockback. However, the Royal Guards can be stunned. I don't know if they can be stunned when they're whirlwinding. They can definitely be stunned otherwise. I'm pretty sure they can be stunned when they're whirlwinding. But we will have some kind of stun or taunt rotation on these to make sure that they stay in place and they don't kill people. The Royal Guards only have 90k HP, which is pretty low. They should go down relatively quickly. The difficult part about this fight really is controlling the adds, and once the adds are dead, the fight becomes fairly straightforward, and it's just kind of a tank and spank on Sertora, and you move out of the whirlwinds every once in a while. But the name of the game here is really controlling the boss and making sure that you're nice and spread out in the room and you're not taking a bunch of unnecessary damage or deaths from the whirlwind abilities. The other thing I've seen recommended is engineers bringing grenades with stuns just to provide that extra little bit of utility and stuns to knock the adds out of whirlwind and stop them from going after people. Definitely not mandatory for the grenades, but probably nice to have if you feel like you're lacking some stuns. The only other thing that they do is Sertora has Sundering Cleave, which is a cleave that puts Thunder Armor. So if the stacks of that get too high on the main tank, you can do a swap and have another tank Sertora. So here is the video.
Random fixation represents the unpredictable nature of this fight due to Sartora and her adds occasionally resetting their aggro and chasing after random players for roughly 5 seconds before returning to their highest aggro target. It's essential that tanks in your raid group rotate their taunt, challenging shout, and mocking blow abilities to control Sartora and her adds, so that they can be held in place for players to maximize their DPS output and for stun rotations, which we will discuss later in this guide. Knockback is an exclusive ability that the Royal Guards have, where they will occasionally send their target flying into the air, which contributes to the erratic nature of this fight. Whirlwind is Sartora's signature ability that results in high AoE damage. It's important to watch your distance, as this ability hits players with cloth armor for 2000 to 3000 damage, while tanks can expect a more moderate value of 1000 to 1500. Sartorial's Royal Guards also possess the same ability, but it deals far less damage, with 700 to 1000 damage in cloth armor wearers, and much lower for other classes. On a final note, remember to use your limited invulnerability potions if you're ever in a tight spot during this fight. Sundering Cleave is associated with Sartora's Whirlwind ability and results in light to medium damage initially done to the player, while also reducing the armor of any players in its area of effect. When Sartora and her adds are not whirlwinding, they are vulnerable to stun effects, which means that your raid group should organize a stun rotation between your warriors, rogues, and paladins if you're alliance. Abilities to keep in mind are Concussion Blow, Intercept, Hammer of Justice, and the most important, Kidney Shot, but make sure to remember the concept of diminishing returns in vanilla World of Warcraft. Kidney Shot will be your most valuable stun, because it shares no diminishing return with anything other than itself. At 20%, Sartora will become enraged, resulting in a heavy increase to her damage and attack speed. At this point, the raid must focus on burning her down while using any available abilities to keep her controlled and stunned, if possible. After 10 minutes into the encounter, Sartora enters a second enraged state that will result in a raid wipe if she isn't killed by then. For the raid positioning section of this guide, I want to first mention that due to how unpredictable this fight is, there isn't a certain layout or stationary position as to where your raid will be placed. Instead, this section will feature a brief overview of the fight and my thoughts, but remember that the real thing will be much different. Finally, Sartora's room is much more massive than shown here, and it's important that players in your raid group stay away from the tunnel leading to the Scarab Gauntlet to prevent additional problems during the fight. Aside from that, you are more than welcome to skip to the next section at any time. The encounter will begin with the tanks followed by the raid moving into Sartora's room once she is at her farthest point. As the tanks collide with Sartora and her adds, healers and ranged DPS need to immediately start spreading out, while the tanks grab their assigned targets and attempt to separate them before the aggro resets begin happening. Proper control and stun-lock rotations should start going into effect as DPS focus on killing the first designated add, which then frees up that tank to help with Sartora or another add. DPS should then switch to the second add and start burning it down, leaving the last Royal Guard to be taken care of. Once the final add dies, the fight should then become straightforward, as Sartora is surrounded and all players can then focus on the last stretch of this boss encounter. As we enter the room with our tanks and a brave paladin taking the lead, the first thing that should be noticed is Sartora's massive aggro range as the fight begins. The tanks immediately engage their targets, using their taunt abilities to hold them in place as stun rotations begin going out. However, while things go well for the target marked as Skull, Sartora and the other two adds have started chasing after random players while whirlwinding at the same time. Repositioning myself to avoid unnecessary damage, first add is already dead as I start casting Shadow Bolt on the second target. Abilities such as Taunt and Concussion Blow are utilized to make sure that it stays in place. Using my Nightfall proc on Sartora, I target the last add, but by the time my spell lands, it's already dead, leaving only Sartora alive. With the adds down, the fight becomes relatively straightforward, as players then focus on avoiding the AoE damage from her Whirlwind ability. By looking at the boss both on screen and glancing down at the debuffs on the target, you can see that with good control and a good stun rotation, the boss is effectively held in place for extended periods of time. By this point, the fight essentially becomes just rinse and repeat. Soon enough, as Sartora reaches 20% of her health and then enters her enraged state, it's important that the raid focuses on burning down the boss as fast as possible, due to her increased damage that makes Whirlwind incredibly lethal. To sum it up, Sartora is a very short but intense fight that will test the personal responsibility of your raiders to mitigate damage on their own, which plays a larger role in future bosses such as Cthulhu and Aura.
Alright, so as you can see, Sartora is a pretty chaotic fight at the start before the ads go down. I've seen other strategies where, because the ads have a knockback, the tanks will separate them much further than you saw in the video and tank them up against the wall so they don't get knocked too far away. But as you also saw in the video, the ads get melted pretty quickly. They have 90k health, which is pretty trivial considering how much DPS we generally output. So the ads should die pretty quickly. The real challenge of this fight, as they noted in the video, is just making sure everybody's got that awareness and knowing whether or not a spitting whirlwind is going to come and kill you. So this fight is just all about controlling the ads and making sure that you are not standing in the way of a whirlwind. All right, we got the first two bosses.
Renor?